Hey guys, welcome everybody. Hope you all had a good week. I'll give it another minute for people to make their way in, and then we'll get started. All right, let's jump into it. Okay, so on the left we got GME, of course, and on the right we got SPY. And I wanted to point out here something that isn't really being talked enough right now. You can see like December 6th or so where the market had a clear top, and since then it's been in a strong downtrend. A downtrend is defined by lower highs. You could see lower high, and then here again, lower high, and lower lows, right? So low, low, and even lower. So SPY's been moving down in a pretty strong downtrend since the beginning of December. When you look at GME in comparison to that, you'll notice something interesting, which is that GME is actually making higher lows and 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 a higher low against the market in that same time span. So in the past month, it seems to be that we've seen a pretty big structural shift in the way where GME is interacting with the market, where in the past it's mostly moved with pretty positive beta to the market. And in the last month, I think it's undeniable that we're now moving with some negative beta. So whether that's significant or not is, I guess, up to the viewer. But to me, that's an obviously underlying sign of strength that we're starting to see shape up here. Now, moving away from SPY, you could also see IWM, which is a small cap index. This thing has really taken a beating. So we can see at the end of November, it was a high of about 244. Now it's trading at 216. So normally, although GME is not actually a part of IWM, it's part of XRT, which I'm sure all of you know. It still generally follows the small cap market, which is down a shocking 12% or $30 in just on a month and 10 days. So really horrible price action in the small cap index. And then if we go to GME on November 25, you can see that it did start to top with the market originally, but once it found its bottom here, which coincidentally is the same time that we got that tweet, since then it's been on a steady grind higher, while the rest of the small caps have pretty much been puking nonstop, relentlessly for over a month now. So while a lot of people like to complain, where's the upside? Why aren't we exploding? Blah blah blah. In comparison to what a lot of the rest of the market is doing, GME is actually behaving fantastic. So it's always important to take these things into consideration and kind of lower your expectations for explosive upside moves while the market is showing clearly defined risk off signals, instead of being hyped for them and then being disappointed. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean GME can't get super explosive. In fact, I think we all believe that that's exactly where things are headed. But again, it's super important to just look at what the rest of the market is doing while we expect GME to make that massive upside move. And what the rest of the market has been doing is puking itself relentlessly for over a month now. Now, moving on to GME. So I was tracking last cycle in comparison to this cycle, and I really thought there was something there with the halving, with the Bitcoin halving, and it felt like GME was kind of following that same halving cycle pattern that we saw from back in 2020 and 2021. So if you go back to, let's go back to 4 years ago for a bit. So the halving cycle was on May 11th, and this halving cycle was April 19th. And I'll show you what led me to dig a little deeper into this thesis. So we saw the halving cycle, and then let's just get it right on here. About 217 days later, so 216 days, we had that bullish weekly trigger, monthly trigger crossover, which shortly after morphed into that massive melt up that we saw in January 2021. And when I was looking at this halving cycle for Bitcoin, you can see that, again, after about 214, 15, 16 days or so, GME also got that bullish crossover. And so it came at a similar enough time frame for me to think that, okay, wait a second, maybe this is all correlated to the Bitcoin halving cycles. And because from the halving cycle to the bullish crossover was a very similar time frame to this halving cycle to the bullish crossover, I assumed that there's a good shot that GME will start to pick up in the same time frame. So from halving cycle to its massive move was about 246 days. That's why, you know, in a lot of my videos, you guys heard me talking about December 20th as like that date where I would expect some volatility to begin. And sure enough, nothing actually materialized. But did nothing actually materialize, or was it short-term squashed? So again, here we had a pretty gigantic candle that same time frame after the halving. And then when you look at what actually happened here, you'll notice that there was some kind of volatility in that same exact time period that we were expecting something to happen, you know, 5 days around December 20th. And what happened was that's when we got that arcade tweet with the present on Christmas, and the next day gapped up to about 34. And again, you know, to me, it was like, all right, maybe we are following the previous halving cycle and this is going to be it. But as you guys all know, we sold off pretty hard after, well, pretty hard in relative, I guess, all relative. But we sold off and we didn't get any follow through on that move like we did back here in 2020. So that was, you know, it was annoying because I did really think for a couple of months that this was going to be it because other things were just lining up so well. The monthly trigger moved so much here because at the end of the month, it got calculated. So that's why you have this jump. Like if GME were to melt up here, you'll have that same jump in the monthly trigger. It's just the way the monthly trigger is calculated, why it looks so strange here. A lot of times when I'm looking at the chart, I'll just remove the monthly trigger so that it's easier to view things. But again, like I think it's pretty easy to tell that the price movements overall are strikingly similar to the way GME was building up in 2020 before that big squeeze happened. And, you know, looking at some of the sentiment that I see on Twitter, a lot of times in the Discord, you just have to imagine, you know, what GME Twitter would have looked like back in 2020. So for those of you that involved, I'm sure you felt this, but started off with a 30% drop and 18% drop and another 30% drop and another 30% drop and a 23% drop before the upside move actually materialized, right? So think about all the pain you had to sit through in order to take part of the January melt up, unless of course you got lucky and you bought, you know, sometime here. But this was obviously not an easy time period to sit through and be bullish. What could have kept you bullish here? Very simple. The fact that price is holding on to the daily trigger tells you that bulls are still in control. And as long as there was no complete breakdown below the daily trigger, that's all you really needed to see to stay bullish during this time period, even with all the constant 30% corrections that GME saw leading up to January 2021. And when you look back at this chart, you know, sure, there's been corrections, but nothing has been remotely as severe as we saw back then. So yeah, we had an 18% pullback, and we had another 13% pullback, and we had another 8%, 9% pullback, and again 11% pullback, and again a 11% pullback, and then here we're pulling back again, another 8%. But again, none of it remotely as severe as we saw back in 2020. And again, if you're trading this chart here, what you'll notice is that all these pullbacks, because the monthly was strong bullish and the weekly was strong bullish, even though price kept pulling back, the daily trigger was always a key area of support for price until eventually things boiled up until a melt up occurred. So with GME, you can't see this upside keep going forever and it just never gets explosive. What it is a simple build up, a launch pad, and then eventually things just reach that pressure chamber or that tipping point where you finally get some massive upside like we saw back in 2020. So again, if you just compare the chart, it's not so hard to see, even if you're less of a visual learner, that we're seeing the same pattern shape where, sure, there's been plenty of pullbacks that I guess you could call it annoying. You could get frustrated at it. You can, throw in the towel and give up about it, but none of it remotely as severe in 2020. That's one. And two, we're seeing the same pattern where the daily trigger, because the monthly is strong bullish and because the weekly is strong bullish, just like it was back here, the daily trigger is that constant area of support. Now, daily trigger has now moved up above 30. So even if price were to pull back all the way here, we now have a lot more of a floor at this $30 level, which is very key for a lot of gamma metrics and other options metrics. So I think it's pretty undeniable to say that GME is in a very bullish spot right now. And sure, it's been tiring and frustrating that we haven't gotten this really explosive push where everybody starts to print on their options and mass euphoria hits the markets and GME becomes the number one talking point in the world again. But all of that is going to take some time. And the good part about that is that we've already had a lot of that time being taken. Like this has already been 2 months. Even here, like since this uptrend started, sure, it took time, but eventually so let's say like the uptrend kind of started here. It did take, 100 days or so for it to play out. So here, I guess this was easily the start of the upside. We're only at like 74 days. So way too early to like throw in the towel and say, wait a second, maybe nothing will happen after all. I think it's way too early for that. I think it's pretty obvious with the way things are headed that like, obviously the Meltup thesis is still on. And there's like, I would say the only time to start getting concerned is if like you lose the daily trigger. But even back here, like there were instances where price momentarily lost the daily trigger, but still held that range. So I don't think there's anything that can really concern me in the price action unless I guess we see like a move below the monthly trigger, and that invalidation is really far. And it's also hard to see that happening, especially with the way things are structured right now. Usually once you have the monthly bullish and the weekly bullish, sure, you can get pullbacks to the daily trigger, but eventually, as all dips get bought up, it will morph into a melt up. And I expect really the exact same thing to happen here. So I want to like really for you guys to understand that the thesis is that a melt up will occur. That's the thesis, right? During this whole time period, there was a lot of people complaining about dilution and bashing Ryan Cohn and, being angry about the price action. And my underlying thesis, what I was tweeting about for months, is that relax, guys. The weekly trigger is going to cross the monthly trigger, and then we're going to have a melt up. Now, the trying to time it like to the week or to the day or to the month, like you get into trouble with that kind of stuff because of GME after all. And if everybody thinks it's going to happen at a certain time frame, if you've been here long enough, you know that means it won't happen during that time frame. GME moves pretty unexpectedly. And I tried. I thought I was different. I thought I was special. I thought I had it down. I thought I could get the dates, but I'm not going to trade based off that. Like, sure, if I think it's going to happen at a certain time, like maybe I'll take a position just for like that time period. But if that time period passes and I don't think anything's going to happen, then I'm not going to like hold and hope. That's not trading. That's asking to get destroyed on your options, especially. So sure, like the December move that I thought would happen, like didn't really play out. Although don't get me wrong, like you would have been in profit playing it, especially if you took profits on this gap up here. But once that window didn't pan out, for me, it was like, okay, like I can't guess when this thing is going to go, but I could use my eyes and I could look back at 2020 and see how this thing developed, and I'll notice all the striking similarities, and I'll maintain a strong bullish thesis that at some point this will morph into a melt up. Now, obviously right here, we see this like double top at 34-ish, and eventually this daily trigger, assuming price is not going to lose the daily trigger, and I mean, like if we all take a look at it, I think we can pretty much agree that the daily trigger looks to be strong, and doesn't look like it's in danger of being lost anytime soon. So that to me is like, okay, just be patient. It's coming. It's obviously coming. All the signs are there. Jamie's also in the best spot it's been for the past 4 years. So continue to let the daily trigger climb. And like once the daily trigger comes up to like 31, 32, that could be enough pressure to finally push us past this breaking point and then really start to get explosive to the upside. Now, another thing to look at, which is another bullish sign, is that, one second, I just want to get all these drawings out of the way because I already had it there from before. So here's another thing that I've been picking up on lately. In the past, it's been pullbacks all the way to the daily trigger before we saw any buying really come into the market. So once price would lose the hourly trigger, we'd see pullback, 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 and then once price got to the daily trigger, big pop, and then pullback, 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 and once price got to the daily trigger, big pop. And then again, every time price would lose the hourly trigger, would head all the way back to the daily trigger before getting a move up. Lately, we've started to see a little shift, and we noticed that instead of price coming all the way back to the daily trigger once it loses this hourly trigger, it's coming back to the daily cloud, which is this light blue shaded region, and catching support even earlier than it did in the past. And we see it again here where price loses the hourly trigger, and instead of like we're used to price coming down to the daily trigger before bouncing, it's catching these bounces earlier and then moving up. And even today we saw it again. So to me, that's like a pretty bullish sign that the algos are moving up their dip buys. And instead of waiting all the way for price to get back to the daily trigger to buy the dip, they're being a little more eager with that. The thing is that like your most explosive moves come off the daily trigger because that's where the most buys are waiting. So I don't think it's the worst thing in the world if Jamie does just get a pullback to the daily trigger, because I think it could be used as a springboard for an even stronger push up. But overall, when I take a look at the market here, and I'll put SPY side by side, while SPY is definitely bearish in the short term, because just like GME, where it's above the daily trigger and the daily strong bullish, so that's why we've seen all this bullish price action, SPY is trading below the hourly and the daily trigger. So pretty bearish price action. But the good news is that the weekly trigger is sitting here at 573, and that is a very likely spot for a bottom in the general market overall. And I think it's possible that once SPY finally does land on this weekly trigger here, we'll see a new high on SPY. So that's above 608, forming a blow off top before the real downside comes. Because if you look at the fear levels in the market, everybody's ready for the market to crash. Everybody's positioned for the market to crash. People are getting scared out of positions. That's not usually when you see a market crash. So while I get that it's scary here, you see that daily trigger below at 573. You see buyers stepping in at the weekly cloud here, at the weekly cloud here, at the weekly cloud here. To me, if SPY can just move down like another $7 or so and bottom here at 573, it'll be best for the market in general, but also best for GME, because I could see the market bottoming here and then moving up for that blow off top, GME bottoming at the daily trigger or so, and then starting the melt up. So overall, there's really no concerns on my part that this won't play out. Weekly velocity looks solid. Monthly velocity is solid and building. Daily velocity is definitely getting a little weaker down here. So again, a dip to a dip to the daily trigger like really isn't out of the question. But I think even if it does, it'll be a great springboard for even better price action in the future. So overall, I would say if we can just get one last flush out of the way, SPY to 573, GME to 3040 or so, I think that'll actually be the perfect springboard for the Meltup to start. And I think SPY will probably make a new high. That could be the time to exit the markets completely. And I think in that new high for SPY, that's when we could see GME, Bitcoin, the miners, alt season, meme coins, all of those things make their final like explosive move before recession hits and the market enters bear territory for the next couple of years or so. So yeah, that's all I got. Mostly, like I just wanted to say, like, okay, things haven't been explosive yet, and we haven't gotten that explosive Meltup move yet. But in general, this entire price action has just been building a launch pad, extremely constructive and bullish price action, even in the face of a massively bearish market. So if you guys have any questions, I'll gladly take them. But otherwise, that's mostly what I wanted to discuss today. I'll stick around for like 5 minutes of questions if you guys have. Reckon we can see a short-term pullback before it springs. So that's what I was saying. Like, daily velocity has been dropping a bit. So, and if you look at each time price taps the daily trigger, you can see it gets much better explosive moves than when price bounces off the daily strength, or the daily cloud. So I think it'll actually be even more bullish if GME could get back to the daily trigger and then take off from there. Yeah, I do think AMC will explode once GameStop does, but until AMC breaks and holds above its weekly trigger, it's just in a death spiral. So for me to turn bullish on AMC, I need to see the daily trigger cross above the weekly trigger, and then you'll almost certainly get a move up to about like 2022 or so. But AMC's got to break and hold 463, and then it needs to hold above long enough for the daily trigger to cross. So like you can see it tried to break and hold here, but it didn't hold above long enough for the daily trigger to cross, and you got a bear plane instead. You want to see U? So here, this is what I was just talking about. So U like got above the weekly trigger here. Finally got the bullish crossover, made a move higher. Let's see where the monthly cloud is at. But yeah, got some rejection here. So I would have actually expected this move to move up at least into the monthly cloud. So like 32. So it did stop like $3-4 short. You don't want to see the hourly trigger and the daily trigger crossing below the weekly trigger. As long as there's a recovery back through the daily trigger before this crosses down, you'll probably still end up getting that move to 35. Do you expect an explosive move or a slow and steady climb like Tesla? No, I expect an explosive move. I just tried to time it for around this December 20th window. And although we did get like some kind of push here, some kind of volatility window, it wasn't really what I was expecting. So I just think it's imperative here to have patience and wait for the daily trigger to keep climbing, keep supporting price, and eventually, like we showed with 2020, these kind of setups, they don't just trudge on up forever. Eventually, it morphs into something much more powerful, and that's where we see our melt-ups. Are you not scared of the max pain being 23 next week? Do you also see it as a two-wave movement, one movement up to 100, some retracement, and a little while later movement to 1K plus? I'm not like this big believer in the max pain theory. Like I get that there's been some correlation, but like I don't think that means price has to move down to max pain. I'd say for me, I'd be pretty shocked if price even loses the daily trigger after bouncing on it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then not even getting to the daily trigger on pullbacks, even while the whole market is pulling back. So I think very unlikely to see the 23 or the weekly trigger anytime soon, barring a complete and utter market collapse. Would a dip below 30 be an invalidation for GME? I think a dip below 30 would be a buy, because anything below the daily trigger, when the weekly trigger is strong bullish and the monthly trigger is strong bullish, is very likely to get bought back up. So we were showing earlier in 2020 where we also had some dips below the daily trigger, but because the daily trigger itself, this light blue line, is above the monthly and the weekly triggers, all dips down to the daily trigger are going to get bought until there's a massive melt up. So you can see the daily trigger bounce here. You can see the daily trigger bounce here. You could see some pinning around the daily trigger here, but eventually resolve to the upside. You can see a little bit below the daily trigger here, bounce right off the weekly cloud and continued higher. You can see some bounces here against the daily trigger, and then eventually it morphs into a melt up. So I think it's very unlikely that price will lose the daily trigger until price has a melt up. Once the melt up happens, then we can see price lose the daily trigger like it did here. Do I think ETH will perform well during Q1? I very much do so. And I get that things have been a little bit shaky in the crypto market, but if you just look at ETH, you'll see it continue to hold its weekly trigger on these pullbacks. So here's where it lost the daily trigger after a really explosive move, almost 100% rally. Lost the daily trigger, bounced off the weekly trigger, and then lost the daily trigger again, still holding the weekly trigger. So I would want to see, like, for a really bullish move here, you would want to see the daily trigger like come down a little bit and the weekly trigger continue. And then once these like get kind of tight and price gets range bound between, once it breaks the daily trigger, that's when you expect that like massive bull run. GME and SOL is something that I think will do great during the actual melt up, but until then it's just gonna follow the general. What happened here? What the hell happened here? But until then, it's going to follow the general market and its triggers, which right now are bearish, below the daily trigger, below the weekly trigger. So I do believe that once, GME melts up, this will do incredible. But until GME melts up, it's just going to follow Solana because it's a Solana coin. And Solana has not been doing fantastic. Also similar to ETH, it's been holding the weekly trigger on these pullbacks. So again, just like ETH, I would want to see the daily trigger like come down maybe towards like the end of January, and then some range bound price action, and then finally break out and explode. What's your secret for moving the chart so fast? I have a good mouse. I recently got a new setup, and it's like a gaming computer. So the mouse is just, it's faster than I've had in the past. Why do I prefer June calls instead of April? It's just in terms of like, if I want to take a really big position, it's very stressful to do so. And like when I know I have all the way to June, it alleviates a lot of the stress. So sure, you can make more money in April calls, but this is just about having a nice relaxed trade without having to check up on it every day. Yeah. Which mouse? I'm not even sure. It has like a picture of like cobra fangs on the mouse. Oh, it's Chimera M7 RGB mouse. It's really good. Big fan. All right, guys. So have a great weekend. Those are basically my updated thoughts. And let's see if we get anything. Yeah, this video, you can watch it later for sure. Let's see if we get anything on Jan 13th. Let's see if we get something this coming week. Good luck, everyone. Have a great weekend.